Thank you for being here. Professor Gordon is professor and head of the Department of Philosophy at UConn-Storrs, honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, honorary professor in the Unit for Humanities at Rhodes University, South Africa, and distinguished scholar at the Most Honorable P.J. Patterson Center for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies, Mona. He's the author of many books, 2 wonderful books on the philosopher Frantz Fanon. He's more recently the author of Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, which came out in 2021. And more recently than that, Fear of Black Consciousness, which is the paperback now out already? Now in paperback. And he's also has a forthcoming book of essays entitled Black Existentialism and Decolonizing Knowledge, which is forthcoming in July on Bloomsbury University Press. He is this year's recipient of the Eminent Scholar Award from the Global Development Studies Division of the International Studies Association. Won't you join me in welcoming Professor Lewis Gordon, who will speak to us about what it means to decolonize philosophy.
Okay, so first, thank you, Professor Jeffrey Burns. Now, the thing in the United States is a lot of people, the EI, they tend to pronounce it "ihn," even though it's auf Deutsch, es gibt ein. So it could be Jeffrey Bernstein or Bernstein, but how do you pronounce it?
I pronounce it Bernstein because my relatives from Belarus pronounced it Bernstein.
Oh, wow, so you may be a distant cousin of my wife. Her ancestors are from Belarus.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. So thank you, Jeffrey Bernstein, for introducing me. Thomas and Landy. Not only in terms of your work in sociology of religion and the center, but also just the importance of putting together this series. And of course, I have to thank the person on whom so much depends, which is, of course, Ruby Francis, the coordinator, I take it, for the center. Professor Jamila Inga Shorter Burhano, she informed me that she was out of town. She wrote me, but I just want to acknowledge her, okay? And in addition to that, you all, hi. Thank you for being here on this lovely day. You know, it's a funny thing. In this part of the country, sometimes people say, it's raining. But in other parts of the world, rain is good luck. Rain is charming. Rain is wonderful. In my childhood, when it rained, we would take off our clothes and run out and just dance in the rain. And that was and so rain, I love rain. It's something very special. Those of you, some people have seen me speak before. I don't speak with my shoes on. So don't be miffed or weirded out by it. I do so for a variety of reasons. One, when you're to speak, you're expected, people come to hear you speak, especially as a scholar, to speak truth, at least truth as you know it. And that commitment, if you look at the history of truth, truth has a long history all the way into concepts such as faith, interestingly enough. Its etymological roots go all the way back through Anglo-Saxon to German, to Wert. And truth, to speak truth, is to speak that which is worthy of faith. People don't talk about it in philosophy that way today. But what's funny is if you look at a lot of other languages, including Latin, veritas, it goes all the way back to Wert, similar roots. If you look at it in Meruneter, in the language of the people of Kemet that you know of as Egyptians, Mai also goes back. It starts at first with actually bringing out into the open, like aletheia in Greek. But as you push it, it still comes back into that in which you should place your faith, okay? So there's an accountability when we speak truth. And that accountability means that one acknowledges its sacredness. And in many societies, you take off your shoes to acknowledge the sacred. And that sacredness is connected also to ancestors. So many acts and rituals of acknowledging ancestors is connected to something. It doesn't have to be your shoes, but some act of acknowledgement. Of course, that acknowledgement is linked to accountability. And if we speak truth, we speak about evidence, evidentiality. And evidentiality means then it's not simply my truth. It's not simply about me. The moment I begin to speak truthfully, I am putting myself at the disposal of others. And those others, you can't be an ancestor. It doesn't make any sense without there being descendants. And that means then that one is taking on the obligation in an act of acknowledging ancestors also to respect those to come. And those to come are people we don't know because we are their ancestors, but they're not just simply about people in the sense of biological offsprings. They could be students, they could be readers, they could even be civilizations that are different from human beings. So that initial act of evidentiality is crucial. Of course, that doesn't dispel the fact that it's also comfortable. You know, and some people may know I'm from Jamaica, and some people say you could take the man out of the island, but not the island out of the man. And in my case, I'm comfortable that way. Now, the topic at hand today is one where there's so many elements. So many elements. So I'm just going to introduce you to some themes, and we can work from there, okay? First, I'll say Winnikisuk. Winnikisuk is Wampanoag for welcome. As we know, the people over in, eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island were Wampanoag, and they met the Pilgrims, and they said Winnikisuk. Unfortunately, the welcome wasn't returned. But there's so many ways to greet people. You could say Winnikisuk. You could say Hotep. Hotep is ancient Kemet, right? It's from the Medu-Neter language. And it means peace. But I could say Shalom. Shalom means peace, Assalamu alaikum. But again, when we say peace, Shalom is more than peace. It's more complex. Because you see, for some people, peace is misunderstood as the absence of war. So they show up and say, yeah, I come in peace. It's like, I didn't know a fight was going to happen, right? But there's another sense of peace, which is I come to bring something that is more than the absence of war, right? It's connected to a question of the kind of world we're going to build, and that's what shalom is about. And salam alaikum is related to it, but in other languages, for instance, in Zulu, you say sawona, and what it means is I see you. I see you. And you can imagine if you're in the wilderness walking, and you're wondering, and another human being goes up and you look at one another and it's like, I see you too. You exhale. So there's already a kind of humanitas, a form of connection in this question of Sawubona. What I'm wearing, by the way, is from the Tswana people. It was given to me by the South African philosopher E. Tswana, Maboko More, and in that language you say Domalenga. Now, so many ways to greet people already opens up the question of how we even can decolonize a greeting, right? There are certain ways that we could do so that's very perfunctory, but there are ways that can really bring out something more profound at work. So, I'm going to go through some stages. First, I'm going to begin with a story. It's a story I mentioned in my recent book, Fear of Black Consciousness. And it's a story, it takes place on a Caribbean island during colonialism. There's a minister, an Anglican minister, and this is really important to bear in mind because British colonialism was Anglican. The Anglican minister is sent to make sure that the children are benefiting from a good colonial education at the Anglican school. So the minister shows up, but that day a little boy was late. And that little boy, as he was late, bumps into the minister, and the minister decides to do some minister work. So he says to the little boy, young man, and the little boy looks at him, yes, sir. He says, could you tell me who knocked down the walls of Jericho? And the little boy looked at the minister, and, he's late for school. He's a little nervous. He said, he knew exactly what to say. He said, not me. So the minister was shocked. He's outraged. So he takes the boy in, and he says, who's your teacher? And he says, Mr., who's the headmaster of this school? Back then they had headmasters. And the headmaster, they said, Mr. Smith. So he takes him to Mr. Smith. And you could imagine Mr. Smith, right? Mr. Smith is from this colony, probably went through schools where he's whipped a lot, caned a lot. You all have been spared that, but back in the day, you get out of line in school, you get a caning, you get whipped, okay? And although I'm Jewish, in my childhood, I had a scholarship to a Catholic school in Jamaica, and I remember when I was sent to the nun because of an infraction, she said, sit there, and she just went, so you get whipped. So he went through all of this, and suddenly he's worked his way up. He's got to this school. He has done a lot of work to get kids to go through, get a better living with his colonial school, and you know. And here's this boy dragged in to see him, and the minister said, "Are you Mr. Smith?" He says, "Yes, I'm Mr. Smith, sir. Who are you?" "I'm the Minister of Education, blah, blah, blah." "What's going on?" He said, "Well, I asked this young man who knocked down the walls of Jericho, and you know what he told me?" "What did he tell you, sir?" "He said he didn't do it." So Mr. Smith looks at the boy, looks at the minister, takes off his glasses, because he's quite concerned. And he says, "Well, sir, I've known this boy a long time. If he said he didn't do it, he didn't do it." Now, this is a story, of course, of miscommunication. And when we raise the question, when people say the word colonial in anything, it almost stimulates a moment of miscommunication. It's a lot like what's happening right now. If you say put race, put gender, you put terms, charged terms into anything, people get a little edgy, and some are turned into slurs, etc. And what often happens with miscommunication is misrepresentation. There could be disinformation. There are all kinds of things that could happen. And it gets even more complex in a context like this one, Holy Cross, right? Because when you are in varieties of Catholic institutions, whether they're Jesuit, whether it's Augustinian, etc., there is, to some extent, an element of you that's already a little ahead of the game. And one of the reasons is because these institutions still have theology. And one of the things in the Euromodern world is that if you have theology, you got to explain yourself. It's like, yo, what's up with that? Why do you have that? And you add to this the complex issue in the Euromodern world, because as we know, the early universities and institutions of higher learning go back thousands of years. But what we call the university only goes back to the 10th century in Bologna. And within that context, those were places in which the center was theological. But as we know, something happened in which the theological moved to the side and the arts and sciences moved to the center. So, and right now we're going through a new secularized theology, because as the arts and center right now struggling because something is trying to push arts and sciences out. And you know what that is? Business. Right? The new cathedrals are business schools. So, within that framework, there is a question of accountability that's already going on, that's pretty rife in Catholic institutions. Some of it is in a context in which some people don't even know the complex history under Euromodern colonialism of many Catholic institutions. Because if you go to a lot of the global south, a lot of the revolutionary leaders, a lot of the people who in the Anglophone world were active in practices of decolonization turned out to have been people who went to Catholic schools. And one of the reasons for that is because of the ongoing conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and in some places where Protestants are hegemonic, the role of Catholic institutions becomes to try always to tell another story. So that's why it's not accidental. In fact, one time I was in Punjab, I was in Chandigarh. I was at a whole group of left-wing academics, political activists. Most of them were Sikh, but there were some Hindus. And we were all talking, and after a while, as they got loose from whiskey. I was shocked to find out they were all drinking all this whiskey. I found out that every single one of them went, except for their PhDs, to Catholic schools. And it struck me as rather unusual. And as we began to talk about this, I've seen this across the globe. So I bring this up at first because when one is going to raise the question of decolonizing a curriculum, it's usually within the context in which one lives. And this context should be made relevant. That's why, okay? So, to get to this question, of course, to talk about decolonizing anything, you need to talk about what it means for it to be colonized at all. And many of us are familiar with the material brute force colonialism, guns, all of that stuff. But to save time, as we already know, you can go and beat the crap out of people all the time, but if you're going to hold people down by force all the time, you will use up all your resources. Right now, with what Putin is doing in Ukraine, as an example, all the weapons and so forth, the point is these issues have been happening in Ukraine for a long time because the other project, which is to get the people to police themselves, to make them complicit with their colonization, is failing. And most notions of colonialism require what's called coloniality. And what coloniality is to make as the ordinary way of life the very system of your colonization. Now, by definition, this leads to lies. So the first thing to understand is colonialism is basically lies. It's a pack of lies. In fact, most isms require convincing people of lies. Whether you talk about sexism, whether you talk about homophobia, classism, whether you talk about racism, and the list is long, you start with a basic understanding. If they were based on truth, then what is the point of fighting against them? It means you really are inferior. It means you really are incapable, right? If you think about anti-Semitism, if it's based on true premises, then you would have to take the position there's something really fundamentally wrong about being a Jewish person. Now, we know that is false. So already, before we even try to explain these things, the basic point is that we're sold a bag of goods that are lies that we're expected to live as truths. In other words, we're asked to live on a bad faith, and bad faith is when you go into the arms of a pleasing falsehood to avoid a displeasing truth. And the displeasing truth of colonialism, well, there are many displeasing truths. But among the displeasing truths is a set of beliefs that have a notion of some people intrinsically having a right to dominate the rest of humankind. Just in a nutshell. And any of you, when you go and look at nature, that's already pretty weird. It's pretty weird. I mean, we human beings, the idea that we walk around superior, I mean, it's just hokey. It's just something, it's really weird, you know what I mean? I mean, think about it, right? Just think about it. Could you imagine you have a child, and the child's born, and you say, you are superior. And then you take the child, and you say to the child, because you're superior, everything you want, you should get. Any moment you don't get what you want is a violation of your superiority. And you raise the child that way. You know what you're going to raise, right? You're going to raise a schmuck. You're going to raise a person who cannot handle any moment she, he, or they don't get what they want. But when you go and look at a lot of the history of colonialism, especially colonial education, it's about raising schmucks. So, all right. In other words, raising people convinced of a lie of their superiority and another group of people of the lie of their inferiority. And to do that, it means you have to do all kinds of things. Think about it. Every comedy series always has an episode where somebody has been telling a lie to their family, and then the family's coming over, and they got to convince all the friends to keep the lie, right? You know what you got to go through to do this, but this happens. And so once we start from that basic premise, that it's actually more efficient to get people not to question the falsehoods, you see? That's now where you come in a relationship with the intimate question of coloniality and education. Indeed, most institutions of power tend to follow this pattern. When people talk about, for instance, the simple negative view of decolonization, which is getting rid of colonizers, oops, I was going to scratch. Hello? Good, it's still there. They often fail to understand that although you may get rid of the people called colonizers, all you're doing, and Frantz Fanon pointed this out, is simply changing the players. If you change the players but not the game, you're going to wonder why you have the same problems. And we see this all over the place. This is one of the reasons why in many countries, the people who inherit the system sit around one day and say, why is it just now a continuation of colonialism just with a different group of people running it? And that's because the institutions of power were not changed. The grammar of power wasn't changed. And in fact, the classic institutions of power are the religious institutions, the educational institutions, the economy, the organization of government. You know, all of these are institutions of power. And there's a longer list. So if you're going to change the game, that is the question at hand with decoloniality, okay? But now, what I'm going to do is very quickly talk about 6 ways when we look at philosophy, and I'm only looking at philosophy for it to function as an example. This can apply to other disciplines as well. But philosophy has a very peculiar role in this. Philosophy has a form of hegemonic status, right, in the educational system. You know, and there are many reasons for this. You know, sometimes when people talk about philosophy, one thing is if you're head of philosophy department, you always watch movies where people say, what are you going to do, study philosophy? Right? When you say, when are you going to get a job? You know, right? And yet, what they don't know about philosophy, you know, you know what the employment situation is for undergraduates who get degrees in philosophy? It's 99%. No. Yes. And you know, whenever I have to talk to people in contexts about this, especially for parents, because they're like, oh my God, my kid is studying philosophy, you know, they start digging the grave, you know. I have to explain to people that a lot happens in the world for you if people believe you're smart. Whether philosophers are smart is another matter. But people believe philosophers are smart. It means that even if you don't have experience in the area, people believe you can learn it. This is one of the reasons. A lot of the people today that people look at and they valorize out there, from actors to people in everything from nonprofits to big, if you're into the corporate thing, a lot of them have philosophy degrees, okay? And so the idea that people think you're smart if you do philosophy, that, like me taking off my shoes, the question of the sacred, that is a serious responsibility to have. Because if people think you're smart, but you're actually dumb as spit, you can do a lot of damage. And make no bones about it, philosophy has done a lot of damage, okay? So, and part of the damage philosophy has done is that in the emergence of colonialism, there are philosophers and their ideas that were complicit with the production of colonialism. And when I say this, I don't mean to talk about it in a reductive, holier than thou, who are the good guys, bad guys way. Because many, when they were doing it, didn't know they were doing it. You see what I'm getting at? In fact, one of the things we need to get rid of is the simple-minded colonizer-colonized model. Because what I just began with, which is that it's a system of lies. There's no way you're going to be investing in lies to others without lying to yourself. There's no way the colonization of people doesn't have the structural colonization of the very people who are located in the act of colonizing. You see? Because to begin to believe you're superior, when it's false that you're superior, is to be out of touch with reality. It's to be out of touch with a variety, a long chain of things that make life meaningful and livable. So, these 6 things I'm going to talk about, these 6 things are, the first is pretty obvious right now. You notice I kept saying the word Euromodern. I didn't say the word modern. I can't stand when people just say modern. And I'll explain why. So the first one is Eurocentrism, okay? The second one is in the way we go about, whether it's teaching or studying or researching, to have the norms of colonization in those practices. That's the game, okay? The third is the commodification of knowledge, okay? The fourth is disciplinary decadence. The fifth is solipsism, technical philosophical term, but it'll be easy to explain later. And the sixth is redemption. Okay? So let's start with the first. And I'm going to, right now, because I know time's limited, I'm going to just make them short. Okay? The first is Eurocentrism. Okay? Eurocentrism basically is the ridiculous belief that all thought, all thinking, anything that's meaningful, all truth, has to be something that comes out of Europe. Right? But we have to ask several questions. First, what the world is Europe? Right? Europe is a phony continent. Why do I say phony? Well, even the notion of a continent came from the British Isles, where the word continent just refers to the mainland. It's just that those people didn't know how big that mainland was. So if you go on that mainland and you keep walking, suddenly you find yourself in Korea. It turns out what we call Europe is just West Asia. That's all Europe is. It's just West Asia. But you see, people didn't always say Europe. People used to have different terms, including what led to certain institutions called Christendom and things like that. The turn to Europe was very historically specific. And it is connected to a ridiculous set of beliefs that required, because if you keep walking and you end up in Korea, you're going to notice people begin to look a little different than they looked in West Asia. And so it was to tag on to West Asia a kind of homeland status of what today we call white people. The problem is that also is a lie, because that place was never, ever, in contemporary terms, racially homogeneous. In fact, even the light people we associate with Europeans today have only been there 8,000 to 7,000 years. So if you go back and look at the people in Europe, they were my color or darker. Some had blue eyes, some had, but they were just nobody that we call today white people. But it gets even more ridiculous when you think about it on a basic level. If you think of a species that's 300,000 years old, and the fact that hominins have been around 2 million years, by the time human beings evolved, Homo sapiens, there was already a lot of action going on. And that's why, for instance, I often say when we talk about technology, there was never a moment of the separation of the human and the technological. We evolved in technology. But the idea to then say, okay, so, and by the way, you notice in certain histories and certain theologies and myths, the time of the earth, the time of civilization is very, almost textually theocentric. So what happens is there's an imagined notion that out of 300,000 years, for 292,000 of it, there were people in Africa basically doing this. and then some inch their way up, and eventually go across, what in the future will be the Suez Canal. And the moment they step foot on what is in the future Europe, they begin to say, oh God, I'm glad that's over. Now we can start cracking. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Let's think about ideas, literature, all of this stuff. When you think about it, this is so absolutely stupid. But it is standard education across the planet. It is absurd. Okay? And so, from there, lots of terms get clouded up because we need to see them as having a kind of pure European origin in them. Even when I said the term modern, all the word modern means is to belong to the present. So in effect, right, how do you know you belong to the present? You think about where you're going, because every time you try to think the present, you have to anticipate it, then it's here. And so the present is always connected to something in such a way that you belong in some way. You're connected to the future. So to make the idea to treat Europe and whiteness as isomorphic with modern is to say to all of the people, you don't belong to the future. And as a consequence, your present is illegitimate, which means you belong to the past. You see? But if people can begin to think of themselves as contributing in some way and belonging, the way I talked about descendants and ancestors, then they are modern. You see? So the truth is, they're moderns. Because Claude Lévi-Strauss said it very well. We're all modern. The mistake is to say only some of us are modern and others are not. Okay? So that's why when I say coloniality, I'm talking about the Euromodern. The tendency to say only being European would make you modern. Now, there are many ways to address this, but we don't have much time. But I'm going to tell you I'll give you a simple example, because we're talking about curriculum. When I teach my introduction to philosophy class, it was so effective, I said, you know what, I'll use it in all my classes. Every syllabus, right, I put in the syllabus on the very first day of class, a paragraph from an ancient woman or man, or we don't know, there may have been a they, but put something that's very ancient, and as a class, the first day of class, we discuss it together. Okay? And so, when I do this, when I said ancient, in your minds, especially because I teach philosophy, you're thinking probably something from, 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. But there are other texts. The one that I use a lot, there are others I use, but the one I'm going to read out to you is actually from 4,000 years ago. And already you could see about the colonization of the mind, right? Because if people believe there aren't philosophical ideas until a so-called Greek miracle happened, which is part of the Eurocentrism, then you're not going to look for philosophical writings that are earlier. So, and since I don't want to proselytize to my students, I simply put it there and we discuss it. I don't even bring up when philosophy began. I just put it. And that way if they bump into somebody and somebody said, yeah, philosophy began in ancient Greece, classical Greece, 2,500 years ago, they say, well, why did I read this text from 4,000 years ago? And the text turned out to be written by an East African. So here's the quote. It's a rather interesting quote. Philosophers, that is, the lover or seeker of wisdom, are those whose heart is informed about these things which would be otherwise ignored. Those who are clear-sighted when they're deep into a problem, those moderate in their actions, who penetrate ancient writings. Now, I just said this is 4,000 years ago. One thing we forget about the past is not everything is preserved. Some people wrote on wood, some people wrote on, especially those who did papyrus papers and so those few survived, okay? So the idea that this text from 4,000 years ago is talking about ancient texts, Man, we're missing out. Anyway, right, so ancient texts, right, whose advice is sought to unravel complications, who are really wise. By the way, the ancient word for wise in Mediterranean is sabet. Means wise teaching. It's from Sabah. The Greek-speaking people pronounced the b, f, so they became Safed, and that's how you get the word Sophia. Okay? Anyway, they're really wise, who instructed their own heart, so in other words, think for themselves, who stay awake at night as they look for the right paths. I often ask students, are you with wonder? They say, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, what keeps you up at night? What do you think about? Right? Who surpass what they accomplished yesterday. Growth, part of education. I often begin classes with a conversation on education. And the conversation is, are you here for certification or education? Many people today are looking for certification, but not education. Now, you can have both. But there are a lot of certified people who are uneducated. I mean, part of our obligation as educators is to have the two meet. Now, here's a strange one. Those who are wiser than a sage. Now, last I heard, sages are pretty wise. So the idea that you're seeking wisdom beyond the level of a sage, who brought themselves to wisdom, who ask for advice and see to it that they're asked advice. In other words, if there's something you've learned, it's enduring. And this is really crucial, right? Because if you start your class hearing from this ancient African, right, then you wonder how many others are there. You may find something, for instance, from a woman by the name of Presihet. And she was actually earlier than Antef, okay? But here's the thing. We don't want to get into this silly battle of first, first doesn't mean best and all of that nonsense. It's just first, okay? However, if we can see the connection between different firsts, we can have a better understanding of our humanity. One of the most enduring statements on the decolonization of philosophy, you all know it, Plato's allegory of the cave, right? If you look at Plato's allegory of the cave, the idea that there are people imprisoned, so it already has the thesis of enslavement, imprisonment. The fire is behind them, they're looking at shadows. They think it's reality. You see the thesis about falseness. One gets out, gets up to the mouth of the cave, has to adjust, blah, 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 and it's like, yo! Now, at that point, the person could have looked back at the others and say, see ya, right? But instead, this individual goes back down. So that's already an ethical act, a political act. And then tries to persuade the people to get out of the shackles and go up, right? And man, you can imagine that kind of a back and forth conversation. In fact, the philosopher Alain Badiou calls it politics. But this struggle is already there. Some people who may get suspicious if you say decolonizing philosophy, you may say, check out Plato's Republic, the allegory of the cave. Because right there, the question of being epistemologically unshackled, the question of trying to work as a community to get out into the open is there, and that is there in Antef. Antef and Plato are connected. But even more, we know there's a problem, because there are some people, we know this, who get up unshackled, get to the mouth of the cave, find the biggest boulder, put it in front, and walk down and say, nothing to see there. Because you can manipulate enshackled people. You see? So part of this task is already a metaphilosophical question of the obligation of philosophy, whether it's Plato, Antef, Presihet, Hyparchia, whether it's Confucius, whether it's Lao Tzu, right? And the list is long. Humanity has always been a struggle to try to figure out how to get out of the cave. Okay? And within this list, it's not just in Africa and West Asia, it's in South Asia. You could think of a variety of people, for instance, like Matri. She was in the 9th century, and she basically argued these similar things. So very quickly then, we have that first one. You get rid of Eurocentrism. And bear in mind, getting rid of Eurocentrism does not mean being anti. You see the point? It doesn't mean being anti-white or anti-European and all that. Because it means open your eyes to when people are speaking truth. You notice I did not try to say Antef is better than Plato or Plato is better than. That's part of the problem. The question is, what do we learn from these people? So we go to the second one, part of our norms. A problematic norm in how we do philosophy and theory is we do it as if it's warfare. And a lot of this comes out of the law of non-contradiction. But we treat it like it's a fight. Think of the language. Beat his or her argument. Defend your argument. Knock them down. Right? But the basic fallacy of that kind of logic is that it's possible to win a fight and be wrong. If ultimately it's about truth, it's not about who wins the fight. There are other ways to get at truth rather than knocking down arguments. Among them is to work as a community to figure out ways to see what you fail to see, back to Antef again, hear what you fail to hear, understand what you fail to understand. That is connected to, instead of negative or battle argumentation, that is connected to demonstration, right? Manera, right? To demonstrate is to make something come out, to be seen, to be open, which means you shift from agonal fighting, right? You shift from that and you go to what's called a communicative model. And a communicative model is accountable to evidence. It means there's humility. You know you're part of a story greater than yourself. And within that story, you begin to find yourself in situations that may actually make you realize the world or reality is bigger than you thought it was. You also begin to develop ethical relations of other people's points of view. You begin to go through all kinds of processes. Now, this is not to say that there's never a time for the agonal. If people are under attack, if there are people misrepresenting reality, sometimes you have to defend yourself and defend it. The mistake is to make it the only practice in town. Okay? So, after you get to that one, you get to now very quickly, the third, the commodification of knowledge. Well, that one's easy. This is connected to something called idolatry. And if there are many ways, especially if you look at Jewish thought, there are many ways to talk about Jewish thought, but a big issue in Judaism is idolatry, right? Do not for a second think you're God, okay? This is one of the things that coloniality attempts, is to prop up. If you're going to create intrinsically superior people, you're going to construct them as gods. But we don't only do that with people, we do that with systems. Even that allegory I did of the way from theology to arts and sciences to those are moments of deification. But we also do it with some of the sites of power like an economy. And among them is capitalism. Now a lot of people talk about capitalism, but they don't understand it, right? And they don't understand it because they don't ask themselves. When most people talk about capitalism today, they always say the words, the market. Why is the market? You see what I'm getting at? Humanity has always had plural, markets. And in fact, when humanity would go to people go to markets, many of you all notice, I mean, they're dying out, but if you think back to the days of the mall, most people don't go to mall actually to buy things. Most people go to malls to socialize. And they may buy something. Well, similarly, that's what humanity's been doing for more than 100,000 years. People would go to meet people to get news, ideas, and they may say, what's that? Well, what's that? And trade, that happens. However, in Euromodernity, a form of misanthropy emerged. And the view was markets were too human. So an abstraction called the market replaced markets, and that abstraction, the market, became that which becomes the legitimating practice of everything else. And that market even takes on the features of a god. If you look at the way people talk about capitalism today, it mirrors theodicy. If something is wrong, it's external to the market. If something is good, it's in the market. But the error people make is sometimes even the way people talk about socialism has the same problem. Because, again, they tend to talk about socialism not as plurimarkets, but as state capitalism, state control of the market. But human beings transcend markets. We're pluralistic creatures. But why this is important for colonization of knowledge is if you commodify the market, knowledge, then if you think about it, you start, instead of talking about knowledge of the market or markets, you begin to fall into the market of knowledge, the market of religion, the market of education, the market of. You see the shift? And within that framework, less truth begins to be pushed to the wayside, and marketability and commodification dominates. And that is one of the things that affect, especially curriculum. Because there are people who are not thinking, like the conversation I talk about with students about education. A lot of people are instrumentalizing thought. In other words, teach every falsehood you'd like as long as it could get somebody a job. Okay? And this problem very quickly leads to a problem called disciplinary decadence. I wrote a book called Disciplinary Decadence, and I have a whole lecture on that, but the short version of disciplinary decadence is when you treat your discipline the way I just talked about the market, when you treat the discipline as if it's God. Think about it. If your discipline is a God, and you forget that disciplines are created by people, then that means the methods of the discipline are perfect. And this is one of the reasons why when people are disciplinarily decadent, when somebody writes something, they don't read it, they just want to know the method. That's method fetishism. But even more, what happens is it leads to a point where the people in the discipline no longer look at reality, because the discipline becomes reality. Now, what, in very concrete, ordinary terms, you ever had a conversation with a literary scholar who tells you you're not literary? And you say, well, it's because I'm an historian. I'm trying to figure out. They say, well, you should be textual. But then you talk with a historian who may say to the literature person, you're not historical, right? The psychologist who says to the sociologist, you're not psychological. The natural scientists who say to the humanities people, you're not like a natural scientist. You see how this is going, right? After a while, then you reach the philosophers who are like, well, the rest of you all are not philosophical. There's an embedded circularity that presupposes the discipline as complete, as having self-contained the answers to everything. Now, some people try to respond to that by saying, let's have interdisciplinarity. But the problem is if each of the other disciplines treat themselves as complete, then you're like ships passing in the night. What you need is transdisciplinarity, which means the disciplines have to recognize their incompleteness, their openness, and actually communicate. Edmund Husserl said it beautifully. He said, at many philosophy meetings, philosophers meet but rarely do the philosophies. Okay? And it means when you go and you study, right? When you're willing to let go and engage what you can learn from others, no single discipline has the bird's eye view of all reality. And so there's a humility in which disciplines learn from one another. And this is, by the way, has been the way great ideas have developed over the ages. Right now, for instance, what led to being able to develop genetics and also virology and techniques for dealing with vaccines was not from one discipline, but a group of disciplines meeting. But even before that, when we think of some of the greatest philosophers you can imagine, there were rarely ever people who got degrees in philosophy. You know, I mean, St. Augustine was a theologian, so was Aquinas. You know, if we think about Ibn Rashid, law, medicine, right? If we think about Hypatia, she was an astronomer, mathematician. If we go all the way through familiar names, John Locke, physician. When we think about Descartes, Descartes, you know, did work in mathematics, was interested in physics, lots of other, David Hume, law. When we go and think about Leibniz was like everything, right? We think about Spinoza, right? Not only in terms of optics and what he was also, the way he made a living, but, you know, just all of these things. We think about Nietzsche, the philologist. We think about William James, the psychiatrist. Karl Jaspers, the psychiatrist. Leo Tolstoy was a physician. We could go through and just keep going with so many others. Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist. Mary Seacole was a nurse. Wittgenstein was a nurse, an engineer, and an architect. Right? Edmund Husserl, a mathematician. Lord Russell, Bertrand Russell, studied mathematics and economics. But all of them, and of course there were people who had degrees in philosophy who turned out to do philosophy too, like John Dewey and others. But the point here is that ultimately, it's where the questions matter, you see? And if you're open to learning from one another, that is part of the decolonizing practice of philosophy. And so I move from there. I have a technical term for that. I call it a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. What that means is being willing to go beyond your discipline for the sake of reality. You see? In other words, philosophy is alive when the philosopher admits that philosophy doesn't have the answer to everything. It participates in the practice. And so, from there, the solipsism is obvious. Solipsism means when you think you're the world, when the idea is the world. Disciplinary decadence is when a discipline treats itself as the world. The redemptive part is a little different. Because you see, with all this criticism of colonialism, there's a point at which colonialism will try to defend itself. And the way colonialism tries to defend itself is to claim that yes, there was genocide, yes, there was, poverty, environmental degradation, and all these things, but the defender of colonialism would try to find a way to say, yeah, but it was worth it. Right? Isn't that the way, right? If you're going to argue with somebody about patriarchy, the person going to defend it is to try to find some way to claim it's worth it. If you're going to talk about racism, someone's going to say, yeah, but. The moment that but comes, you know where it's going. And so, but here's the thing. You see, there's already a crisis of justification. And if one is going to begin to decolonize what one teaches in a curriculum, it means that one has to bring into it the form of critical humility to say even the notion of worth has to be put under critical evaluation. You see? That there is no worth that takes the form of an outcome before performance. So, to conclude, if we're going to be working on decolonizing curriculum, the first part is just do it. If I go in front of students and talk to them and tell them that there's all this literature by women writers, indigenous writers, and so forth, and then I just go teach the same old, that's a contradiction. That's hypocritical. Instead of forcing it down people's throat, the thing is to learn it and teach it. And this means you have to rethink what it is to be a teacher. A conversation I often have on the first day of class is also what is a professor and what is a student. And students invariably think professors are like Moses with the tablets. And after we talk for a while, I say, I got to tell you, here's my view of a professor. A professor is a student who fell in love with learning. And we fell in love with learning so much that we continue to learn even if we have to teach ourselves. And when we are going to try a point where we have to teach ourselves, you know what that's called? Research. But here's the thing. Every semester, even if we teach the same course every semester, each class has a student with different experiences that would mean you can learn something that's why in my books, I've never written a book without an acknowledgement to students, because we learn together. So once you structure a classroom as a co-learning environment, of course the student knows you're an advanced student. You know a lot. But there's agency in a student knowing as a beginning student, he or they can bring something to the learning experience. Additionally, it means then that research is crucial. But research as continued learning means don't worry if you start imperfectly. The point is, each time you make it better. Right now, people are so hung up about whether they make a mistake, they do it wrong. The result is such a safe zone that hardly anybody's learning anything new. All right? When I first started with this material, I used whatever I could get, but then I began to notice certain anomalies. But I had some advantages because among my areas of study is classics, and because of being Jewish, I had this connection to biblical Hebrew. And I began to see certain things that struck me as really odd in ancient African languages. So then I had to go study meta-netter and so forth, right? But it meant that the me who's able to speak now is 40 years of learning. But I could only get there if the earlier me took on the task and lived through my mistakes. You see? So that means we have to create zones and ways of learning. And that's already there. If a professor says that the way I'm teaching, although I'm called an expert, every time I'm learning, it's a community that has room to build on those. And it means, for instance, I began to notice, for instance, as I began to offer text, there are people I thought were men that turned out to have been women in history. It's just that we presume often that it's men who did things, and we didn't question it. I was so happy to find out there's an Ada Lovelace Institute. I don't know if you all know who she is, but a lot of what you do today, you wouldn't be able to do without her. She's the one who developed the algorithm for the computer, okay? And, there are others, a lot of people don't ask certain crucial questions. We talk about light bulbs, and we talk about Thomas Edison, and phones, and we talk about Alexander Bell, but it turns out they didn't invent those. They owned a company that had the patent. The person who invented them was Lewis Latimer, an African American, right? A black man. But he didn't own the patent. He developed them. So we're able to have our lights the way we use them, our telecommunications the way we use them because of him. So even though I was thinking in one way, that led me into other things. If I think about wireless technology, I think of Grace Walker and I think of Hedy Lamarr. These were two women who developed wireless technology. Hedy Lamarr, you might know, she was a Jewish actress, very famous, and everybody talked about her for her beauty. But after she smiled in front of the camera, she was one of the United States secret weapons. Right? She was developing wireless technology. But the list is long. Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Oh yeah, Hedy Lamarr. She was. And but there's so many people like that. You see what I'm saying? So part of decolonization, and this is the main hook, we need to understand that colonization is a form of dehumanization by constructing people as if we can be what we are, isolated by ourselves, whole. So that means if ideas come from an individual whole, who, WHOLE, who produces it. But if we understand human beings as relationships, then we understand that humanity working together produces ideas. And within that framework, it now has an agency, not only for students, but also for us actually to tell the truth about reality. We begin to learn more about how we commonly build the world, and it means then that the colonial situation is also debunked of its ontological status as complete and closed. It means we're able to see the people throughout who have always presented alternatives, and we also could actually demonstrate through our practice the importance of truth prevailing. So, this then raises the last point. I talked about those descendants, but Iris Young, Carl Jaspers, and many others had this concept called political responsibility. There are many people who talk about it, but the versions that are beautiful are Jaspers and Iris Young. Hannah Arendt did too, others. I write a lot on it, Frantz Fanon did, but it's a different kind because you see, a danger when we get very moralistic, moral responsibilities tend to be so individualistic that it gets personal and it closes people off. But political responsibility is what belongs to everybody. It's what you are responsible for, even though you're not the individual who did the action. If you think about the responsibility of making this a good, a healthy society, it's not one individual having it more than others. We all have that responsibility. You see? And that understanding of the political responsibility requires the transformation of the understanding of power. Because what colonialism has made us inherit is a coercive view of power, the Hobbesian model. But rarely when people talk about power do they define it. But power, from potus, from which you get potent, so people think Latin, but don't be fooled. Part of the colonizations make us to think that all thinking began in either Latin or Greek. But actually, potus was the Latinization of pathe, which is a Medu-Neter East African word. And pathe was a rather interesting term. It's a root from which you get words like pharaoh. And pathe, right, it means the ability to make things happen. But, and this is the insightful relational metaphysical point, it doesn't matter what ability you have. If there are no conditions, nothing is happening. It doesn't matter if you have legs. If there's nothing on which you can stand, you will just keep falling. It doesn't matter if you have eyes. If there's nothing interacting with them, you can't see anything. And so pathe could only make sense connected with the concept of ka. And ka is an interesting concept because ka can be translated as life force, womb. It's a very feminine term. It could also mean an activator. And this is crucial because you see, having the ability linked to the conditions, power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. Education is an access condition. You see what I'm getting at? We're trying to activate people's ability. We're actually, when we're educating people, trying to make them powerful. So we need a positive view of power. And if you think about it, we need the power to dispel lies, to empower people with truth. And when we think about it, when we're trying to build better institutions, we're trying to increase the options by which people can make meaningful choices to live livable lives. And so this part of decolonizing the curriculum then means that we're ultimately always trying to set conditions for something that transcend ourselves. It has an immediate humility, and it also means, if you think about it in political terms, a more robust understanding of political action is that it transcends the self and affects a world in such a way that it enables others to do things. If you try to hoard the power, you oppress people. If you facilitate people's ability to act, it means that your action will reach the anonymous. And the anonymous is rather interesting because a colonial model says you cannot be obligated or committed to people who are not clearly, distinctly representations of yourself. I call that the narcissistic model of love. However, every one of you in this room have experienced the ability to love that which is not identical with yourself. And in fact, that ability I call radical love. It's ability to set the conditions for those who you will never know, but because you've set those conditions, they don't know you, but in every one of their actions, they look back and are saying to you, thank you. Because had you not acted, there wouldn't have been the livable, better reality. And so, your work, every one of your work, as you reach out to be the continued student to learn, is to offer for humanity that which would make our descendants say thank you. And with that, I'm done.
Do you want to field your own questions, or do you want me to?
Sure.
So
I
we
can
have
do that
time for
since I
some
have the mic.
questions. I'm just going to ask, we'll use the mic because we're being recorded for posterity.
And please say your name. You could probably guess I'm out of the closet humanist.
Gee whiz, I'm standing up. My name's Larry Cahoon. So, thanks very much. Terrific. Here's my question and maybe a criticism.
Mm-hmm.
So, with 70% of what you say, totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
And hence, with some of the 5, in the paper you wrote it was 5, but
Mm-hmm.
the aspects of coloniality that need to be addressed, okay, in philosophy. Total agreement, however, it's entirely true, I totally agree. Nobody knows enough history. Nobody recognizes pluralism. Nobody recognizes the vast places and ways that something we can very legitimately call philosophy, if we're just concerned with that, but we don't have to just be concerned with that, popped up all sorts of everywhere, okay? The notion that it was all Greek and that it's all European. Anybody who reads any history already knows that's false, okay? But some of the other aspects, like the markets, specialization, I mean, really you're critiquing specialization and the solipsism and stuff. Whereas the first couple of points about Greek philosophy and about history and about the Nubians, all this stuff, that's very old, but that has nothing to do, or very little to do, with modern Eurocentrism and with some aspects of modern Eurocentrism, which are really recent. So, for example, I mean, part of what you say is like a critique of over-specialization in philosophy. 100 years old? 70 maybe, it's been really bad for the last 70. Which means that the cause of it can't be the same thing. It's another inadequacy, but it's not all part of the same thing. Or, for example, just the last point is, it's true, modo means now. So, right, everybody's always modo. But you got to have some word for something that happened in Europe in the last 300 years, because if you don't, you can't also criticize it. So so it doesn't have to be modern, be something else. But just like agriculture started, agricultural cities in the Bronze Age 3,000 years ago, that was new too. So got to have a name for each of these things. So it could be modern, could be something else. But.
Thank you. Very quickly, the argument is manifold, okay? For instance, if one wants to talk about the past, few hundred years, I was using the term Euromodern, right? It's a very specific term. Because people are asking different questions, they're discovering certain other things. It turns out agriculture goes back 14,000 years, not 3,000, because people began to question these things and do the research. Yeah, and yeah, it's really striking. And they're right now, not only in terms of archaeological work and stuff at the Smithsonian and others, but particularly in terms of how the Nafutians are understood. And Natufians were people in what is today what we would call around between Israel and Jordan and those areas. But again, they were actually baking bread. These things are found. There are other things that we could bear in mind, but the argument about specialization is not actually the point about hyper-specialization. That's well taken. The argument, however, is not against specialization. It's what we consider the specialization to be. If we see our specialization as like a key that opens a door to other doors, like if we think about language, our native language is like a specialization. But the old mistaken view of language is that our language is complete, so when you meet another language, you map on one language to another. But the problem is, many languages have terms that are not in the other language. Not only terms, concepts. And they're untranslatable into the base language you begin with. The old bad model was to say you now cannot communicate. That is false. What every one of you who's multilingual know or studied a language is when you encounter something you don't know, you start using it, and eventually one day you understand it. In other words, language gives us the capacity to learn other languages. And that expansion expands our experience. And what happens when you learn it, you go back and people in your base language would say, wow, you understand the word, what does it mean? And you're like, I can't translate it. But then like, well, how did you learn it? You see what I'm getting at? So that argument is, I stress, not against specialization, but it's an argument about what specialization means. And there are many terms we can use. The question is going to be their utility to facilitate learning more. So for instance, because of the kinds of conversations archaeologists have with geneticists, have also with people who are not scientists, like bakers, okay? Have with people who may do different kinds of work in carbon dating and so forth. That is why now the claim that agriculture is 3,000 years old is now gone. There are other things that are also. No, I'm not saying you said that. I'm saying for a long time that dominated. Part of our work as truth seekers is to be able to reach a point where we realize when we were wrong. That's all. So the underlying argument is about how do we make decolonizing a constructive project. And the argument is to not lock it exclusively in the question of what we're eliminating. It has to be also rooted in what we're trying to build. Okay? And I'm not the only one who said that, by the way. Catherine Walsh says that in her work on coloniality, but many others. And people have been saying it way before us. They just didn't use those words. Antoine Firmin in Haiti, in his Equality of the Races, that's what he argues. You could see this in writings of Du Bois. You could see this in so many others, writings of Aurobindo, Nishitani. So there are people out there. Now, one other thing. It does appear overwhelming, right, when we say that we need to learn more. The mistake we often make is when we think we need to learn everything. Nobody could do that. If we could do that, we'd be gods. What we need is to have a commitment to a sufficient level of learning to facilitate more learning. That's the way the argument goes. There are some people because I don't only work, I have professorships in many disciplines. I did not plan to have them in many disciplines. It's just that the curiosity, the questions in the communities I worked with led to my work being used in those disciplines. And after years of saying, I am not a specialist, I kept writing so much that as people were using it, I became known as a specialist. So it wasn't my interest initially to say be known in Jewish studies, Africana studies, the work I do with theoretical physicists in multidimensional theory, the work I do in musicology, the work I do with education theorists, the work I do in political thought, political economy, anthropology, etc. It wasn't like I said, let me get a list. It was more along the way, it's like on a journey and people join you and you're having a great conversation. And you say, wow, and suddenly they say, you could take this route and check this out, and suddenly you're like, oh wow, there's a river there. And then as you keep going, you're like, wow, there's some great fruits there. And along the journey, you're just learning so much. And that's the idea. The idea is to make sure that the practitioner keeps alive the love of learning. That's the idea. Sure.
So maybe I'll ask, I know a number of us are going to get to have dinner and discuss there. Is there anyone here who I didn't think to invite to dinner, who I should have? Anybody else who has a question that you'd like to bring up? Nathan?
Could we have, so if some others have questions too, that way the questions are on the table, because even if I don't get to answer them, the question would be good for you to think about over the series. So go ahead.
I'm Nathan. I wonder if you could say more about when you were discussing bad faith and requiring belief. So maybe in the specific case of racist bad faith, anti-black racist bad faith, requiring belief, then I suppose counterposed to knowledge then, or evidence to the contrary. And then maybe more specifically about like what Fanon calls the paralogical, of sort of like having this short circuiting of reason. So despite being faced with someone face to face, another human person, being able to look and then look past them and say, no, I refuse to accept this evidence of their humanity here before me. And maybe say a little bit more about how you see the connection between belief and reason, especially whenever I see things like paired together, like racist reason. I think that must be like a paradox or something like a realm of pathologization, going on there, and like how that's possible and like what the mechanism is there, or what is being built into. It's like what you might say is like institutional forms of bad faith, how myths and mores and folkways, go into that. If you could say something about that.
Thank you, Nathan. Could some others who have something to say something? Okay, then I'll just go to Nate. Did you want to say something? I'm going to be next. Okay. Well, the short answer, Nathan, is that there are several things going on. One is when we stop and talk about a certain individuated model, right? There's wonderful work by a scholar. Her name is Michaela Ott. And she talks about dividuation. Individuality or individuation is actually come from the Latin adoption of ousia from Greek, right? And dividuation, which is different, is about our interconnectedness with all of reality. So individuation separates us from reality. And in that separation, we often, to maintain that separation, develop certain false beliefs, such as, well, there isn't really reality. In fact, today, a lot of people are antipathetic to reality. Often when I give talks, people almost get upset. What's this reality thing? People are socialized to be anti-reality. Bad faith is about that, okay? But belief is a more complicated phenomenon, because belief by definition is an admission of a limitation. But when a person is in bad faith, the person could transform belief. One, either to set up the standard to be perfect belief. But if there were a perfect belief, it shouldn't be called belief. It should be called knowledge. But then there's the other one, which is the over-subjectivizing of beliefs, to reduce everything to belief, which of course eliminates accountability. Evidence cannot even emerge if we were all just locked completely into individual beliefs. So that's one of the things. The thing with Fanon is that Fanon understood that well, but Fanon was also addressing something in a very interesting clinical way. The interesting clinical way is that he had to deal with a conundrum. Some people would come to him with a concern about being mentally ill, when in fact their source of suffering is that they were healthy. Right? Now, what do I mean? Well, if there is a woman who comes to him and she's talking about suffering from a constant questioning of her intellectual capabilities, or over-sexualization, or she's upset at being underpaid, and the list goes on, Fanon's response is, well, let's imagine you were not upset. If you were happy with being treated that way, you would have to be ill. You see what I'm getting at? So he would say to her, you're upset because you're healthy. If you're upset as a black person for being profiled, for the violence, the lynchings, the long list, that is normal. What is abnormal is to be a person who in the past would be diagnosed with drapetomania, right? Drapetomania was an old illness. It's when an enslaved person is sick from the desire for freedom. I think you're healthy if you desire freedom. There are many examples of this. So what Fanon's answer to those people was, it's not for the psychiatrist to medicate you to be at home in an unjust environment. It's your humanity that makes you homeless in an unjust environment. What you have to do is to become what he calls actional. You must, in other words, you know the way I close with that political point? It's because racism is a political problem. But what we've inherited is a view of looking at political problems as individually moral problems. And that's why there are more people obsessed about whether they're called racist than doing something about racism. You see? Fanon would much rather an individual who says, I have certain problematic beliefs, but I think the society should be structured better and work to make it better. Now, some people, if they're moralistic, will be obsessed that that person has those beliefs, and instead of spending the time making the society better, is obsessed in trying to change that person. However, the constructive project of building a better place can be one in which there are people who are not going to meet what we're looking for as perfect people. I think Audre Lorde had it beautifully, because everybody knows her statement, you know, the master's tool doesn't tear down the master's house, never did, never will. But they misunderstand it. And the reason they misunderstand it is because they didn't ask the next question. Do masters actually build houses? Right? You notice, as I was giving little bits of facts here and there, right? What about the women and men who build those houses? What about their creativity, the stuff they put into it? It's their tools. When we think of enslaved people, again, we have a lie. Here's the lie. There's a black person in Africa walking in the bush naked, not knowing what to do. Enslavers come, capture him or her, put him on a ship, brought him over. It's complete nonsense. What that world was were countries with states, economies. There were people who were physicians. There were people who are knowledgeable of the legal. When I brought up Ibn Rushd, right? That's pre-enslavement, right? If I bring up also Ibn Khaldun and others, these are people who are in Africa who were trained. They were in educational systems, right? These are people who, if you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, what many people don't know about Solomon Northrop, you know the scene where he was able to build the irrigation system? Now, how did he know to do that? Where did he learn that? His father was from Africa, was an enslaved person who taught him. Because in many African societies, farming required special irrigation systems. In other words, these people had their knowledge. It's their tools that built a lot of these houses. Oh, my toenail got long and I just put a hole in my toe, so don't worry, I wasn't shabby when I arrived, but I'll be leaving shabby. But so the point is, no, that is the lie. Humanity as tools. Now, here's the thing. People say, tear down the master's house, right? But if you have all these tools, why not build better houses? Think about it. If you build a better house, what happens? Well, you have a party's going on at these other houses. And, right? And what are they doing in these other houses? Man, they're cooking food that actually tastes good. You know what I mean? Spices and all kinds of other stuff. They're dancing. They're talking ideas. They may build the houses now in different ways. Why do we believe, for instance, that a city must have high-rises? It's just not ecologically sound. Why don't we start build geothermal cities that spread out? Use our creativity. And before you know it, everybody's hanging out in that house, so Mr. Master says, I am the master, and says, but nobody's coming over. So the master opens it, why am I getting no visitors? And here's, and after a while, there's the, what's up? It's like, well, yo, what's going on? Like, party, baby. And you see what I'm getting at? We're so focused on what we're to want to tear down that we don't think enough about what we want to build up. And we fail to think about the tools we already have at hand. Think about my story about how I learned a lot of what I do here, right? These were not just tools that I got from when I went to college, right? Right? I studied classics, philosophy, physics, political science, and in classics, I was lucky. It wasn't just Greek and Latin. We learned varieties of other ancient things, right? But that's still university. But what did I learn at home? Well, at home, I had Rastafarian uncles. This is not Rastafarian. This is from Judaism. But they were Jews, right? I learned stuff from my great-grandparents, right? I learned because my great-grandparents were alive when I was born. I learned from my relatives who came from Jerusalem in the 19th century. My relatives who came from Shannon, Ireland, they were Sephardic Jews. Knew them and the knowledge they brought. I learned, I was a child, they would sit on their lap and the women in my family would talk all kinds of ideas. And I would soak it up and learn it. In other words, I was learning that everybody you can learn from. I learned from my Chinese grandmother. As a child, I spoke Cantonese, okay? Because they were from Guangdong, China. And because of that, that brought me into a world where I just don't understand a world in which people could look at people as ontologically separate. It makes no sense to me. I could see the common humanity in my Chinese grandmother's eyes. My Liberian great-grandfather, he was a 6'10", dark-skinned man, right? My Cuban relatives, you see what I'm getting at? And learning was revered in different ways. It's not just a classroom setting. I had an uncle who used to, when I was a child, take me on long walks. He was an ill man, but he was so brilliant. A walk with this man was magical because he would tell you about every kind of plant, what it can do. And it turns out later, I learned that, and it's true, it works. It helped me when I was dying from before the pandemic, COVID-19, some of the things he taught me. He taught me how to make glue. He taught me different ways to make fire, but it was just casual, joyous conversation, okay? He was very strict, though. I mean, strict in the good sense, but there's certain things he would never, he really was like kosher, you know what I mean? But the thing is, when you're in the Caribbean, it's a looser Judaism because we're Mizrahi and Sephardic. And so we weren't busy trying to show people we were Jewish. We were just Jewish, you see? But it created an opening for different kind of learning. And that spirit is something when I came to the United States, I just saw all over the place. Even though with all the hostility and the racism, there were these interesting pockets. I had a friend whose father was Sicilian and mother was German Jewish. And he had this problem because he was a confirmed Catholic and a bar mitzvah, which is how he worked out that contradiction is another matter. But the thing was, we used to love to go to his Sicilian grandmother's home. And the stuff she would cook, and I love cooking and the stuff you would learn, and you're picking up The Jewish background I'm from, we didn't speak Yiddish, right? That's Ladino and other language. But in New York, you learn Yiddish, okay? I met Holocaust survivors who would, I did this because they would show me the tattoos. And you would learn. There were people, the whole world was just so rich with learning. But we have so limited the capacities of how we learn, the pedagogies, the critical pedagogies, that they're ultimately taking us out of the relations that constitute learning. And so, returning to the earlier question, the point is, I know I don't know everything. Whenever I give a talk, you know what I say to myself? Remember, you know what you're talking about, so only talk about what you know. Don't pretend you know everything. However, there's so much to learn that even if I spend a lifetime on the stuff I would like to study, it would only be a tiny fragment. And so with the bad faith stuff, the bad faith is to lie to the self that you can know it all. And part of this, one last thing on it, just for Fanon, I think this you all will find this useful. Many people don't understand the title of Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Mask. Many people think the book is about black people wearing white masks. Wrong. The book is about two kinds of bad faith. The first one is the bad faith that black people are completely sealed in our skin. That's the black skin. In other words, to see black skin is to see all you need to know. There's nothing more to learn. Right? But the second bad faith is called white masks. What is the white mask? The white mask is actually what most white people wear. It's the mask that lie to white people about them being more than human. You see? If you think about what many white people among white people are, they know they're human beings just hanging out. But if a person of color pops up, white people have to pretend they're an idealized creature called white superiority. So they have to pretend they know more, pretend they're better, pretend. And white people learn to live a lie, the white mask. And there are other people who are not white because they believe that white mask is the way white people, really are. They try to imitate that mask, you see? And so Fanon's argument is if you're going to have a lie of people above people and a lie of people below people, what happens to people? And that's why he says something very profound. He says that colonialism and anti-black racism and white supremacy are the attempted murder of humanity. Because under those conditions, to be a human being is illicit. And so if we dispel those lies, it requires articulating our humanity. And there's a lot more he says, but I think that would be useful. Okay? And I know we're out of time.
I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.